We did the Cold equations, critical lens analysis. Starting off with the biographical lens, Tom Godwin was born June 6, 1915. In his career, he authored 3 books and over 30 short stories. He was an acclaimed science fiction author, and his twist in the Cold equations brought a new aspect to the genre. He had a rough childhood, which included the death of his sister from an accidental shooting after he had been playing with the gun which killed her. Godwin suffered from kyphosis, a curvature of the spine. In Maryland, Godwin was forced to drop out of school in 3rd grade. He was enlisted in the Army for a few months until he was discharged because of his kyphosis. He then lived with his father in Arizona, where he made his living by making dry washers and writing in his free time. He met his wife, Lariola, through selling dry washers. He worked in the Forest Service in Washington State in the early 70s, and during this time, his wife passed away. Godwin's dark past can be seen in his novels, such as the despair from Marilyn on the ship knowing her fate to be killed, and his rough upbringing in which she had to work to survive is mirrored when we learn that Marilyn also dropped out of her studies to support herself. On page 13, the pilot thinks to himself, for the first time, he saw that she was not wearing vegan gypsy sandals, but only cheap imitations. The expensive vegan leather was some kind of grain plastic. The silver buckle was gilded iron. The jewels were colored glass. Daddy's little shop just brought in a bare living. She must have left college in her 2nd year to take the course in linguistics that would enable her to make her own way and help her brother provide for her parents, earning what she could by part-time work after classes were over. This relates back to Godwin having to drop out of his school for his family in 3rd grade. The sadness from Marilyn's brother relates to Godwin's pain when he lost his wife. He does a good job of showing the pain felt by the brother and sister because they know it was the end and he understands his pain felt by them. On page 15, Marilyn states, I didn't want you to feel that way. I just wanted us to say goodbye because I have to go in a minute. Originally, Godwin wanted Marilyn to live in the story, but he was forced to kill her off by John W. Campbell, the editor of Astounding Science Fiction. This want to keep her alive could be because of his regret of his wife's death and how missing her, and an ending with her survival could feel like closure for Godwin. And his wife's death took a toll on his mental health. He moved to Texas, where he lived with his adopted daughter's family. And Godwin suffered from alcoholism his entire life. In 1980, he died in a Las Vegas hospital. Here in the bottom right, we see him and his dog Newbie, and this is him in his later years.
So I had the gender/feminist lens. So while this short story does take place in a kind of future dystopian universe, we are able to see many characteristics of some sort of gender norms that are brought up throughout the story from kind of the time period that it was written in. So we see this central idea that women are starting to be included, however, they are still drawn back by these gendered roles given by society, and that they aren't seen as like kind of, I wouldn't say valuable, but like they don't contribute as much to society from whenever the time that this is written. And it focuses on this idea that men have to be the ones in control and kind of the main people working and taking charge in society. So, as mentioned before, this story focuses on the men in the story taking charge of the situations going on. And it was also written in a time when women were still not treated as equally as men in society. They were kind of all grouped and given these stereotypes. So to add some context to this, it was written by a male author and written in the early 1950s. So around this time, kind of the main role women were given was just kind of like start a family, be a good wife and mother, and they weren't really thought of as to like bring income into the household or go out and have a job. So it's very uncommon to see anyone other than a male leave the house. Women also felt a tremendous amount of stress from societal pressure to just like have that wedding ring, just kind of like have a good marriage, be a good wife, and all those types of things. So this idea of the masculine thing to do also became more prevalent in society around this time when it came to the workplace. So they were expected to get up early every morning, put on a suit, go to work while the wife stayed home and took care of the kids. And relating this back to the short story, we can see this idea of the men having kind of control in the workplace whenever there's conflicts throughout the ship and between the only women on board and the crew that was all men. So this quote from the story says, "Now what? Had it been asked in the deep, defiant voice of a man, he would have answered it with action, quick and efficient. He would have taken the stowaway's identification disc and ordered him into the airlock. Had the stowaway refused to obey, he would have used the blaster. It would not have taken long. Within a minute, the body would have been ejected into space had the stowaway been a man." So throughout the story, we see the men obviously taking charge. Whenever they find her on the ship, everyone kind of seems perplexed about the situation, no idea what to do. And they kind of treated her differently than they would have of a man. Like, as it said in the quote, they would have ejected the stowaway into space right whenever they found them. But they did keep her on board, which was different than what their like kind of values were on the ship. So we kind of see them treating her differently just because she is female in this situation. And we see her, they kind of like, they see her as maybe not as like matured as them or not as tough. So they treat her with, like, they kind of treat her more of a, I don't know, I say like a, they kind of just like, see her as more vulnerable and in a passive kind of way. So I think that throughout the text, it reinforces this idea that men are stronger than women in society, which at the time was still the idea of money and a very generalized stereotype in society just for women, kind of grouping them in this like very passive sense and not giving them that much of a role in society because they seem not like as capable as men as doing stuff. So there was a generalized bias also due to the fact that the author of the story was male and was writing at a time when women still were kind of oppressed and not didn't seem as capable as men in situations. We noted that to be incorrect today, and like, but it was just the generalization of the time. So we also see points throughout the story where the girl was given kind of this treatment because they did not know what to do with her and saw her as weaker. Said before, it said within a minute the body would have been injected into space with the story of a man. So we just see her kind of being treated differently just because she was a woman, and they have this like passive attitude against her and more like they kind of bring in more emotion. But she kind of contradicts this whole idea and these stereotypes for women because throughout the story she does have more, she just shows more like strength than any of the men on board. She breaks these stereotypes, and towards the end of the story, she offers to sacrifice herself in order to save the rest of the crew, which none of the men would do. So she's kind of more bold in that way and breaks these stereotypes of being weaker than the men because she is the one, in fact, that did offer to get ejected just to save the rest of them, just because of the whole fuel problem that they had. And just that, like, we see her break these stereotypes that they thought about women in the time that they weren't really capable of much. Like they weren't capable of having a job. They weren't strong. They just had this passive role in society. So we see her break those stereotypes throughout the story, and it just kind of leads up to the event in the end where she sacrifices herself in order to save others. And then here are my two discussion questions for the gender and feminist lens there. How do you think the captain would have acted if the intruder was a man instead of a woman? And what do you think this has in relation to any gender stereotypes that are still kind of thought of today?
So my lens was the archetypal lens. So the cold equations, the story being told here is archetype of man versus nature. So the quote I selected here was, to him and her brother and parents, she was a sweet-faced girl in her teens. To the laws of nature, she was X, the unwanted factor, the cold equation. So the thing to glean from here is that nature is unwavering. It has strict laws that don't change for anyone. And it's oftentimes futile to try and change it. And so that's what Godwin did when he wrote the stories. Kind of the repeating theme of many multiple stories of surviving, man versus nature, and surviving it, that's just being rehashed. So the title of the short story, The Cold Equations, is a direct reference to this harsh, unforgiving laws of nature. So the classic stories of man versus nature show that the protagonist is often at the mercy of nature's laws. Think of movies such as Castaway or The Revenant. The protagonist is often faced with perilous challenges that are beyond their control. So the story is just a reimagining of this classic story, but instead of being set on Earth, it's set in a spaceship where the law is all stowaways must be jettisoned regardless of who they are. And that is the law that cannot be broken, no matter who is there, regardless if it's a mean man who's bent on harming people or a sweet-faced girl in her teens. Another archetype shown in the story is the one of sacrifice and choosing the greater good. In other words, choosing the needs of the many, needs of the few, regardless of how much the choice feels morally wrong. The quote I selected for this was, these little ships are always given barely enough fuel to reach their destination. If you stay abroad, your added weight will cause it to use up all its fuel. It will crash then, and you and I will die, and so the six men waiting for the fever serum. It was a full minute before she spoke, and as she considered his words, the expression of numbness left her eyes. Is that it? She asked at last. Just the ship doesn't have enough fuel? Yes. I can go alone, or I can take 7 others with me. Is that the way it is? That's the way it is. Nobody wants me to have to die. Nobody. So, in this instance, the greater good is 6 people dying from the fever that was pointed out earlier, and the girl has to make a choice to sacrifice herself or let them all die. So this archetype is used to create high-stress situations with no good options in order to generate conflict. Another archetype present in the story is the loss of innocence. So the quote I selected for this was, what did he mean to go through with it? To just me, to go through with it. What did he mean? Not the way it sounded. He couldn't have. What did he mean? What did he really mean? Her time was too short for the comfort of a lie to be more than a cruelly fleeting delusion. He meant it the way it sounded. No. So 2 things I want to point out here that I found really interesting was the repetition of the phrase, what did he mean? What did he mean? So that's kind of, at first her denying that this is going on, that she's trying to make sure that she's not hearing it wrong. She's trying to deny that this is going to happen to her. And another interesting thing that I really found fascinating was the line, her time was too short for the comfort of a lie to be more than a cruelly fleeting delusion. So the person, or the pilot rather, could very easily have lied until the last second, but instead he tells her the truth and shatters her innocence, that she could just pay a fine and get off easy and go see her brother without
so with little consequence. So Marilyn is the youngest girl. She's from Earth. She's never had to face hardship from the frontier. Well, she's faced hardship at Earth because she was poor. The frontier is a whole different place that's unforgiving. And when faced with the inevitability of her demise, she starts resisting and loses her blissful ignorance. However, in the end, she has to come to accept and is fully stripped of her innocence. This kind of signifies it, this quote right here. He let her walk alone and made no move to help her, knowing she would not want it that way. She stepped into the airlock and turned to face him, only the pulse in her throat to betray the wild beating of her heart. I'm ready, she said. So the two discussion questions I have for the class are, what part of the story concluded the loss of innocence for Marilyn, and how does Cowan put a unique spin on man versus nature? Thank you.
So I did the Marxist lens for this story, and the main conflict of the girl, basically the pilot has to decide whether she lives or dies, and this main conflict reflects the social and political conditions at the time, and it shows the harsh nature of the society they live in which it was divided between those who remained on Earth and those living in colonies in space. And their transportation in between these worlds involved space cruisers, which carried the colonists to their new worlds and made periodic visits, running on tight schedules, but they could not stop and turn aside to visit colonies scheduled to be visited another time. And for this reason, EDSs were made and were designed as a method of delivering supplies or assistance when an emergency occurred on a world not scheduled for a visit. And so this shows the difference between the two societies and how they have this fragile balance that can't be interrupted for anything. And another quote that reflects the harsh nature of the society is, her brother was of the frontier and he would understand, but the others, her father and mother, they would not understand. They were of Earth and would think in the manner of those who had never lived, where the safety margin of life was not a thin line, and sometimes nothing at all. And so this shows that these two different societies live these two different lives and have these two different outlooks. And so her parents aren't able to understand why something so harsh needed to be done. But her brother, who was of space, understood the reasoning behind this. And so it shows the differences between the two populations. And then the story also reflects on class difference, and we see this as the pilot by law is required to eject all stowaways no matter the circumstances, and no sympathy is given to anyone, even if it was just a mistake. And the choice between who gets to live and the decision is ultimately to continue on with the trip to save the 6 men in the story. And a quote that shows this is, it was the law and there could be no appeal. And so this class difference, basically, we see it like, because the pilot and the commander of the EDS, they basically decide who is worthy of living and who isn't, and ultimately they decide to save the 6 men rather than the girl. And so this just shows like the class difference between or in the world at the time. And we also see a class difference between the difference in treatment in men versus women, which is kind of talked about already in the feminist gender lens. And some quotes that showed this are, within a minute, the body would have been ejected into space had the stowaway been a man. And a stowaway, there was a slight surprise to the question. That's rather unusual, but why the emergency call? You discovered him in time, so there should be no appreciable danger, and I presume you've informed ship's records so his nearest relatives can be notified. To which the pilot responds, she wanted to see her brother. She's only a kid, and she didn't know what she was really doing. I see. All the curtness was gone from the commander's voice. So you called me in the hope I could do something? Without waiting for an answer, he went on. I'm sorry, I can do nothing. And so we kind of see this more sympathetic tone towards it being a woman than if it were a man, as the pilot tries to come up with a way to try and save the woman, but ultimately he is not successful in doing this. Although I think if there were a way, he definitely would have tried, but only if it was a woman, and that is reflected in the story, and that tells a lot about the class differences at the time and how men and women were treated differently. And then the story revolves around an issue of ethics to let the girl die or the 6 men. And to connect it to a contemporary issue, one that is pretty relevant at the time would be at the height of the pandemic, in which some doctors in some parts of the world had to make decisions on who was to receive ventilators due to a shortage, with one doctor in Italy stating that we have to decide who must die and whom we shall keep alive.
So, the formalism lens. In formalism lens, we can find examples of irony, oppositions, and complexities. In this short story, a girl is not going to a EDS ship and is going to another planet because of her brother that lives on that planet. So, she thinks she has to just pay a fine, but her added weight means that they don't have enough fuel to finish the trip. And she believes she is sacrificing herself, but learns that she is the one to be sacrificed. So there's no choice but to eject her into space, or eject their crew. Satire, irony, and character are in the setting shows that life has to be sacrificed for the good of others, whatever the circumstances. This cruiser must maintain the schedule. The lives of not one, but many depend on it. I know how you feel, but you'll have to go through with it. As you can see, although she thinks of herself as the one who is doing a deed that has no choice to sacrifice herself, whether she likes it or not. And this is, yeah. So connecting that lens, everything in this lens is supposed to be taken literally. There are no mistakes in the piece of writing in which the author literally means everything she or he says. So when the woman says, "What did he mean?" she said, "He meant it. He meant it the way he sounded." This is irony in itself because the lens is supposed to take the lens literally, and he's saying literally telling the woman that she's to take what he said literally. So he meant exactly what he said, and as we can take away from this small dialogue, these characters, what the commander said must be done. There's absolutely no choice but to eject. The formalism lens questions: does the author intentionally use irony in the character's traits throughout the story? Like, does the character or the author use traits of the woman and the crew members as like ways to emphasize the theme of the short story itself? And question two: how is sacrifice used to demonstrate the priorities of the team or the crew?
And then these were just our discussion questions as a group as a whole. And then here is our little bibliography. And I think that is